Hello then, Year 11. This is the revision video for the Norman Conquest. Now, before we start on the Norman Conquest, we need to understand the background of England in 1066. And the first thing we need to understand, unfortunately, is that someone is looking a bit upset there because he's dead. Now, who is the person who is dead? Well, that is Edward the Confessor. Now, he's called Edward the Confessor because he is a religious man and he was a well-liked king of England. However, he dies and unfortunately he is left with no heir. Now, that does not mean they had a bald head with no hair on it. It means he has no sons. It is spelt like that, heir. Okay, so there is nobody who can take over from Edward the Confessor, or nobody who can easily take over from Edward the Confessor anyway, which means we have to know about who were the potential kings of England in 1066, the contenders to the throne, if you like. Well, the favourite is this man, Harold Godwinson. Okay, why is he the favourite? Well, he is sub-regulus. That means he is effectively the deputy king. He runs England day to day for King Edward the Confessor, because King Edward the Confessor by this point is quite old, and Harold Godwinson runs England for him. He is the Earl of Wessex, so he is a powerful English nobleman. Okay, and Harold Godwinson's sister is actually married to King Edward the Confessor, so he's got his sister married to Edward. So he's got a really good claim to the throne there, hasn't he? He's got a really good, clear claim to the throne. Now, we'll change colour here because we're going to see who's the next contender. Well, the next contender, okay, is William of Normandy. Now, why does William of Normandy think that he should be the king? Well, he's a childhood friend of Edward the Confessor, because Edward the Confessor lived in Normandy as a young man, and he thinks that Edward has promised him that he can be the king of England when he dies. Why else? Well, actually, Edward's mother, okay, was a Norman, so there is a family link between the Normans, okay, and Edward the Confessor, remembering of course that Normandy is now in northern France, so that's where William has got to come from. Okay, who else could be the king then? Right, well, we'll go over here, and the next king could be Harold Hardrada. Now, that name, okay, means hard ruler. He is the Viking king of Norway. So you might think, well, why would the king of Norway think that he should be the next king of England just because poor old Edward, there he is, has died? Well, that's because King Canute and then several other Viking kings were previous kings of England. And one way that you can inherit the throne if the king dies with no heir, as we see there, okay, then they can look back to previous kings and find a relative of them. The closest living relative to the previous Viking king of England, I'll make a note that he is a Viking, is Harold Hardrada. So he has also got a family claim. But what you might notice actually is, and I'll just change the colour of pen so you can see it more clearly, what you might notice actually is that all of these people have a family claim to the throne, either through marriage in the case of Harold Godwinson, through Edward's mother in the case of William of Normandy, or by going back to a previous king of England, alright, all the way back to the famous kings who descended from King Canute, who were the Viking kings of England. That gives Harold Hardrada his claim to the throne. Now, there is one more person who thinks that they perhaps should be the king, and that is Edgar the Atheling. Now, he is not a favourite, and that's why I've left him till last, unfortunately. He's unlikely to be the king because he is only, bless him, 14 years old. So he's unlikely to challenge the big scary Viking king of Norway, the powerful William the Duke of Normandy, or Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English earl. These are three really powerful men. Edgar the Atheling is only 14 years old, so he is unlikely to become the king. However, he does have a claim, and unsurprisingly, like everybody else, it is a family claim. Okay, and he is the only one actually who's really closely related to Edward the Confessor. He is his great nephew. I say really closely, it's not that close, is it? But it is closer than anybody else. So he's the great nephew, and Ed treats him like a son. He lives with Edward the Confessor when Edward is still alive. So there's a possibility that Edgar could be the king. However, as we've said, when you've got Harold Hardrada, big scary Viking king of Norway with a claim back to previous kings, you've got William of Normandy, Duke of Normandy, with a claim through family and a promise, and with Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English earl, the deputy king effectively, and whose sister is married to Edward, you can see that really it's about him, or him, or him. So we find ourselves asking, what happens next? Well, just prepare yourselves, children, for a little bit of geography, because this is an excellent drawing coming up of Great Britain. Can you see that? There you go. There's England, Scotland, Wales, right. There's Ireland, just for reference, although at the moment we are not bothered particularly about Ireland. So, there is London. Okay, who is in London at the moment? It is Harold Godwinson. Harold Godwinson is chosen by the Witan, the Council of English Earls. They say, okay, you can be the next English king. Now, this should be not be a shock to any of you, because Harold Godwinson was an English earl, the Witan was a council of English earls, so they pick him. Now, Edgar the Atheling, not much of a threat, so we'll put Edgar up there, small boy, 14 years old, there he is. He's not much of a threat, he's not in the sea, that's just putting him out of the way. Now, the problem is, he's got two other people who are a threat indeed. The first one to arrive comes this way, from Norway. Norway's over there. And who arrives? Well, who arrives except the King of Norway, Harold Hardrada. Now, obviously, Harold Godwinson is all the way down in London, so he cannot get immediately up there to face up to this problem. Luckily, Godwinson has earls all around the country. He was an earl, he was the Earl of Wessex. Well, as the new King of England, he's got earls all around the country. And the two earls who are up in this area of the country are Edwin and Morcar. Now, unfortunately, for the English, at Fulford, which is just near to York, Fulford, the English earls Edwin and Morcar lose. Okay, they are beaten by the Vikings, who have arrived on 300 ships. Okay, with approximately 7,000 men. So they're a big, scary force. And Edwin and Morcar only have about half that number. However, Harold Godwinson is off on his way with his army from London, and he's trying to get up to tackle the Viking invasion. He hears about the defeat at Fulford, and he speeds up, and he arrives eventually finding the Vikings at a place called Stamford Bridge. Okay, now that is not the Stamford Bridge where John Terry used to play. That is a Stamford Bridge again in North Yorkshire. So there's now another battle at Stamford Bridge. However, this time the result is quite different. Whereas at Fulford, there's my English flag, the English were beaten. At Stamford Bridge, the English won. How did they win? Well, they came across the Vikings unprepared. The Vikings did not expect Harold to make this journey so fast, and they came across most of the Vikings without their armour. Nonetheless, it was still a very difficult battle, and Harold Godwinson, there we are, HG, Harold Godwinson, ended up down 5,000 men in this battle. He had to sort of sacrifice 5,000 soldiers to defeat the Vikings. The Vikings, though, were completely beaten. Hardrada himself was dead, and the Vikings left, instead of on 300 ships, they left on just 24 ships. However, a pretty bad turn of events now if you are Harold Godwinson. Harold Godwinson up there, he's just lost 5,000 men, but he's defeated the Norwegian Viking army of Harold Hardrada. Hardrada, one of the main contenders to the throne. Remember, we just saw here that there were 4 main contenders to the throne. Well, one of the four main contenders to the throne is now out of the picture. Harold Hardrada has been killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Now, unfortunately, if you are Harold Godwinson, you hear 3 days later that at a place called Pevensey, William of Normandy has arrived. Now, Normandy again is just off our map, our excellently drawn map, but we're going to put it down there, and there's the arrival, okay, of William. Now, if you are Harold Godwinson, you'll be really cheesed off at this because it could not have been at a worse place. You've just had to walk about 190 miles in 4 days with your army up there, fight a battle against 7,000 Vikings, you've lost 5,000 men, and 3 days later, somebody else who wants to take your crown off you has turned up down here. So, what does he do? Well, he sets off back in the other direction. And it takes him a bit longer this time. He goes to London first for a few days, but eventually, on the 14th of October 1066, he gets down to this region, and the battle takes place just here at a place called Hastings. Now, Harold Godwinson, before he even starts this battle, makes a key mistake in that he tries to get there too fast, and he does not wait for potentially 30,000 extra troops that he could have picked up in this area around London. He'd already picked some troops up, but he could have got even more. He did not wait. But the battle was set for Hastings. So we'll move on then from this slightly messy depiction of what's going on around England in 1066 to a slightly neater summary. So we've already heard about the Battle of Stamford Bridge. That was on the 25th of September 1066. The Vikings were caught by surprise. Harold Hardrada was killed. The Viking threat is over, but there are 5,000 Anglo-Saxon dead. Now, he's walked all the way back down to Hastings as Harold Godwinson, but we need to know what happens here on the 14th of October 1066. So you can see it really is not a long time between two of the most important battles in English history, each of them containing two potential kings of England fighting against each other. Well, what happens at the Battle of Hastings then is this for a start off. There is a hill, it's called Senlac Hill, okay? And actually it's the French, the Normans, who reach this area first, but they position themselves down there, so I'm going to draw myself a little French flag, okay? They position themselves down there at the foot of the hill, so there's more room to manoeuvre, which leaves the English up there at the top of the hill. Well, in the first instance, the English actually look quite good. They've got a shield wall, a solid line of shields, that's their tactic. At the top of the hill, the Normans, they've got cavalry, that's men on horses, they've got archers and they've got infantry. But the arrows fly over the heads of the English, and the infantry and the horses, and I'm not going to try and draw a horse, I'm just going to draw an infantryman walking up the hill, cannot succeed against the English who are stationed there at the top. Now, some people will say this next bit is a deliberate tactic. Some people will say it's a bit of luck that gets turned into a deliberate tactic. But either way, it is the definite turning point of the battle. A rumour goes round that William of Normandy himself is dead. I'll just put there to remind ourselves. A rumour. However, the rumour turns out to be untrue. William is not dead. In the story, in the legend, he takes off his helmet and he says, "I am alive, and with God's help we will conquer yet." Now what happens then is, the feared, F-Y-R-D, these are the English peasant soldiers, they start to run down the hill though, because they think that William is dead, and they see some of the Normans running away. Now this is where we don't know if it's a trick or a deliberate tactic, but either way, William turns this to his advantage and goes to use a trick called a feigned retreat. A feigned retreat means a fake retreat, a pretend retreat. William pretends to run away. The English who are at the top of the hill, they follow him. They break ranks, which means their advantage of being in a shield wall is over. They've lost that advantage. Now, they are very easy to kill for the Norman cavalry, for the infantry, and it all starts to go very wrong for the English. At about 4 PM, the Normans make the final fatal charge up the hill. At this point, King Harold's up there, still, and he's got only left not much of his feared, his peasant soldiers, but But the only soldiers he's got left now are his trained soldiers. They're the house carls. The house carls. They're the trained soldiers. And they form a last defensive ring around the king to try and save him. But an arrow flies from the Normans and hits poor old Harold, I'm afraid to say, there he is, in the eye. That is shown in the bio tapestry. There's no way to know if that's true. I've drawn him with a smiley face there for no particular reason, because he wouldn't be smiling, would he, with his arrow in his eye? But what that means is the King of England, who's been chosen to replace Edward the Confessor, is dead. Harold Godwinson is killed, and at this point the army, the feared and the remaining housecarls begin to melt away. It's a clear victory for William of Normandy. So to represent that, we'll put him up there, look. Well, and he would be smiling because he has won the Battle of Hastings. So just before we move on from Hastings, we need to ask ourselves a sort of summary question, which is, why did William win? You've heard about the events, but basically you can divide this into two sides. There are things that William does well. Basically, William's successors. That's the first reason why William wins. That stands to reason, doesn't it? Well, his successors are this. He uses that feigned retreat. Now, whether he planned that from the start or just took advantage of a rumour that went round that he was dead, it did work. The English left their position on the hill because of this. What else did he do? He had archers. One of them struck the decisive blow that hit King Harold in the eye, but they also thinned out the English at the top of the hill, eventually, once they adjusted their range. And lastly, William fought on horseback. He could see more clearly and communicate more clearly, sometimes using flags. He had people to do that for him, so that he could get a good view of what was going on in the battle, and he could direct his soldiers accordingly to make sure that the Normans would come out on top. However, you could argue that the Battle of Hastings ended up as it did because of Harold Godwinson's failures. Did he give it away effectively to William? Well, what were his failures? Well, he left potentially 30,000 troops that he could have collected because he wanted to start the battle quickly and take William perhaps by surprise, like he did with Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge. The feared peasant soldiers were very poorly trained and in some cases fought with farm equipment that had to be picked up on the way down from Stamford Bridge because so many had been killed, and they compared very poorly to William's highly trained specialist soldiers such as his archers. And lastly, Harold fought on foot. This was an Anglo-Saxon tradition. It was not tradition to fight on horseback, but it meant that again it was at a clear disadvantage to William of Normandy, who fought on horseback. The one last thing that I want to suggest could go on here is pure luck. Would this have all happened if, and it was by pure coincidence, that Harold Hardrada had not invaded just a couple of weeks before? The only reason the timing happened as it did was due to the weather in the English Channel. So bear that all in mind, because you could have to answer an 8-mark question about this. It could come into an interpretation question as well. So bear in mind the importance of the Battle of Hastings and why did William win. Okay, so the next section of this video is, how does William actually control England once he takes over? Because obviously William's got a really severe set of problems to deal with. He, as we know, is from Normandy. That makes him French, that makes him foreign to the English. The English earls will not like him because he's just killed one of the English earls that they chose to be the next King of England, and there's no reason why the English people would particularly like him, given that he's essentially a foreign invader. So how does he keep control? Well, as you can see, I've divided this page into 4 sections, which you may also want to do if you're going to revise this. He controls by using patronage. And we'll come back to what these are shortly. He controls by using concessions. He controls by using terror. and he controls by using military presence. We know what military means, essentially soldiers or the army. So he controls by those 4 ways: patronage, concessions, terror and military presence. What you need to know is what each word means and one example of when he does it. So firstly, patronage. That's the first and the easiest thing really that William does to keep control, okay? And it means giving land to followers in exchange for loyalty. So all his own people, all his own knights and barons who fought with him at Hastings, he uses patronage to give them land in his new country that he's conquered in England so that they stay loyal to him. A good example of that is Robert of Mortain. Okay, Robert of Mortain. That's an O-R-T-A-I-N. Robert of Mortain. Now, he is the half-brother of William the Conqueror, and he makes him the Earl of Cornwall. So he's got land in England, he can make money, he can take taxes, he can control the area, and he will remain a loyal follower of William. What else does he do then? Well, he uses terror. Now, patronage is the first thing he does. He gives land to his followers. That's quite an easy win because his followers are already just that. They're already on his side. But what about when things don't go so well? Well, then he goes to the two that I've got down here. So in terms of time, really you might want to look at this first and then sort of this and this, broadly speaking, at the same time. So, terror. Well, the best example of terror is this. 1069, the harrying of the north. People in the north of England, in the Yorkshire area, rebel. They involve the Vikings because the Vikings have got influence in this area, and William decides he needs to deal with this rebellion. Now he actually pays off the Vikings, which means there's a little link to concessions that I'll come back to later, so they go away. But what about the local English, the Anglo-Saxons? Well, he murders people, he burns property, and he salts the earth so that nothing will grow again in the north of England, in a whole big area all around Yorkshire, so that they will be scared, they will be terrified to challenge him again. In conjunction with that, really, in combination with that, is the idea of military presence. Okay, William builds all around England. Eventually builds several hundred castles. Okay, motte and bailey castles, and he builds them so that the local nobles like Robert of Mortain, who he sends to control the English, have got somewhere to live, and there's a military base, so that no major town is more than 1 day from a castle. No major town is more than 1 day from a castle, so that if there are any rebellions, they can be put down very, very quickly. You need to remember, of course, what the motte and bailey are, which the motte is the hill, the bailey is the bit with the facilities, the town, the houses for the peasants around the bottom. And you need to think broadly about both the short-term purpose of castles, which is strategic. That means it provides a military base to control the area, but also the longer-term purpose of castles, which is symbolic. Castles are large, impressive buildings that show the English very clearly who is in charge, and eventually the idea is that they won't even need to use the strategic purpose because the English just won't dare, in combination with the terror and just the impressiveness of these buildings, which, when they're made out of wood in the first instance, can be built in a matter of weeks. The last one then is concessions. Now, concessions, William is able to do this method once he's already set up his reputation using terror and military presence, so the people take him seriously. The best example of this is in 1071 with a guy called Hereward the Wake. That's Hereward the Wake. A strange name, but it was his name. So what is concessions then? Well, that means giving something away, but not to your followers like with patronage, but to your enemies. It means giving something to your enemies. Now, of course, you don't do that for no particular reason. It's a deal. And in terms of Hereward the Wake, he was given his land back in order to stop rebelling, and he did. William defeated his rebellion in 1071. That was in East Anglia, in the area now around where Norwich is. But he was able to make a concession to Hereward if Hereward promised to be loyal to William. So you can see there's some similarity between patronage and concessions, but the difference is he can do patronage right at the start to his followers because they're already on his side. He waits 5 years before he makes a really big concession to Hereward the Wake because he's got to set up his reputation. He's got to do the harrying of the north. He's got to establish his military and his castles. Because if he'd have tried this concessions tactic straight away in 1066, the English wouldn't have taken him seriously and wouldn't have been scared of him and would have just asked for more and more and more.